Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Why would a serial killer confess to a sadistic spate of brutal murders? Find out on Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Prince of Wales Drive in Battersea, SW1. 3 streets east of Peter Bryan's failed suicide bid having killed Nisha Sheth. 2 streets south of the first of the infamous taxi driver murders. And 2 streets west of the lost fingers of the tortured artist. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Prince of Wales Drive is a very exclusive part of town. Consisting of 5 and 6 story, red and white brick mansion blocks stretching the full length of the road. These multi-million-pound serviced apartments have stunning views overlooking Battersea Park and the River Thames, being strictly for those with money. Accessed by a secure communal door, this isn't the kind of place where you'd find a fat, dole-scrounging slop watching Towie in his pants and scoffing chips from the bag. Oh no. As here you'd find a rotund investment banker watching Downton Abbey in his diamond-encrusted G-string as a butler feeds him beer-battered chips made by Gordon Ramsay himself from a Louis Vuitton bag. Oh yes, it's all a very different thing indeed. And yet a senseless and brutal murder in one of these exclusive flats, its exact number never reported, marked a sadistic killing spree by a psychopath who was clearly disturbed and dangerous. But it also helped to unmask a suspected serial killer who couldn't help but confess to many, many murders. He was a killer who wanted to be caught. But why? My name is Michael, I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 343, The Blabbermouth, Part 1 of 2. His first victim was an elderly widow by the name of Barbara Pinder. Born on the 17th of July 1908, Barbara Ann Wilson, as she once was raised in the comfortable and calm splendour of the seaside parish of Selsey in Sussex, a place whose name means Holy Island. With her father being the town's rector, they lived in the rectory with her mother and 2 siblings, Helen and Wilfred. And being middle class, they were educated at private schools, and they had everything they wanted catered for by a nurse, a maid and 2 servants. In 1921, with her father being the rector of nearby Cuckfield, the family moved into the vicarage, and it was here that Barbara met her husband. Walter Archibald Pinder was born in Bishop Stortford and raised with all the benefits that money can buy. In June 1929, as a couple in their early 20s, they married at Cuckfield and had a son called Simon. By 1935, they were living in the poshest parts of West London, being Kensington and Chelsea. And for many years, her sister Helen lived with them at Rectory Chambers. With Walter being an aeronautical engineer, he was often busy, especially as the Second World War loomed large. But again, having 2 servants and a governess, this gave Barbara the rare chance, unlike many women of that era, to pursue a career. For many years, Barbara was an aeronautical journalist and the former editor of Flight magazine. But her true passion was music. In her youth, she'd been the main understudy of the principal players for Ivor Novello, one of Britain's most popular entertainers in the first half of the 20th century. And as a professional pianist, she was instrumental in the hit West End play, Perchance to Dream, which played at London's Hippodrome from 1945 to 48. And as a heartfelt thank you, Ivor Novello signed and gave her the original transcript of the show's biggest hit, We'll Gather Lilacs, which was something she always cherished. On the 20th of March 1980, Walter died. and although this loss of a husband of 41 years could have broken her, described as a widow of great charm and distinction who seemed young for her years, she kept herself busy as a writer and an artist. She was active in the church and liked a good long walk. By 1984, living alone, Barbara moved into the small, self-contained flat on the 3rd floor of Prince of Wales Mansions in Battersea. It was safe and secure as many of the occupants were elderly and well off, and even though she was a petite 76-year-old lady who was immaculately dressed and always had neatly coiffured hair, said to be young at heart, she had the drive and stamina to last beyond her 100th birthday. The day before had been unremarkable. She'd received no odd phone calls or visitors. She wasn't worried, and the only difference to every resident's day was the workmen who trudged about the flats due to a recent fire which had led to the partial collapse of the roof, hence the communal door was left open. No one knows exactly what time she was attacked on the morning of Saturday the 27th of October 1984, but as an early bird and a creature of habit, she had failed to pick up a newspaper from the shop. With no witnesses, only evidence can paint a picture of what happened to Barbara Pinder. It's unlikely that she knew her attacker. As being a private person, her door was rarely open to others. With no sign of any break-in, either he knocked, possibly posing as one of the many builders on site, but with her son Simon noting,
"She was wearing her walking shoes. She always took them off when she got home,"
leaving them on the mat by the door. Therefore, it was more likely that someone had followed her in. Behind a locked door, although she was only tiny, with every ounce of her strength, she put up a brave fight to get this stranger out of her home. As with the furniture knocked and crockery smashed, as she was tossed about like a ragdoll. As Detective Superintendent Kemp later stated,
"She didn't stand a chance."
Towering over her, her attacker was large and powerfully built. As bruises proved that with one hand he strangled her, squeezing her windpipe and fracturing the bones in her throat. As with the other, he beat her about the face and the skull with a hard, undetermined blunt object, breaking her jaw, her teeth, fracturing her cheekbone. And although she was barely conscious, his attack was far from finished. As she lay, slumped and broken on the carpet, he repeatedly kicked her in the head as if she was a ball, which caused cuts, bruises, bleeding and brain damage. But this wasn't the end. With her own knitting needle, he stabbed her in the neck to torture her, and left it embedded in a psychotic level of sadism which detectives later felt was a trademark of his killings. But even that wasn't the end. As with a knife, believed to be a 6-inch stiletto blade, he frenziedly stabbed her 45 times in the chest with a level of ferocity. The pathologist stated,
"Most of her vital organs were in shreds."
As he'd stabbed her in the heart, liver and stomach, as well as severing her breastbone and several ribs. The murder of 76-year-old widow Barbara Pinder was a massacre. And yet, it had no obvious motive. A stranger attack on a wealthy woman where nothing was stolen. Her handbag lay open, £30 was left untouched, as were her antiques, pieces of jewellery, and the valuable manuscript by Ivor Novello. She was viciously attacked, but she hadn't been sexually assaulted, and it's unlikely she knew her attacker. The next day, Simon, Barbara's son, rang as he always did. Getting no reply, he drove from Avon, found the door locked, and with the police breaking it down, inside they found a mutilated body. Recalling the horror, Simon said of the scene,
"He must have been a madman."
With her brutal murder reported in detail in local and some of the national papers, the barbarism of her injuries sickened and shocked the community. Many demanded the reintroduction of the death penalty, and lead detective D.S. John Kemp stated,
This is one of the most savage and senseless killings I have ever come across.
But it would prove impossible to solve without a single witness to her murder. Fingerprints were found at the scene, but they didn't match any known felon. The police hadn't a single suspect. And having taken 390 statements and interviewed 75 people, they were no clearer to a name or a motive.
As it seems likely that someone had come here to kill, not to steal or assault.
A service took place for Barbara at Chelsea Old Church on the 6th of December 1984. At the inquest, almost a year later, Coroner Dr. Paul Nabman asked D.S. Kemp,
"Is an arrest imminent?"
But he had to admit,
"Not in the immediate future."
Detectives warned pensioners living alone in Battersea to take all precautions and not to let any strangers into their homes, as they were sure he would attack again. And almost exactly a year later, he did. Little is known about her early life, even her birth name or her hometown. But 86-year-old widow Henrietta Osbourne, known as Peggy, was the epitome of this particular attacker's perfect victim. Like Barbara, she was small. But being frail, partially blind, and almost totally deaf, she was housebound. She had few visitors beyond a social worker, and spent many hours a day in the armchair, sat beside a fire, listening to her music, which was always played too loud. And again, that meant there were no witnesses. Again, as with Barbara, she received no strange visitors or calls that day. She wasn't worried, and living in Lumley Flats, part of the Ebury estate on Passmore Street in Chelsea, just 1 mile north of Barbara's home. Inside she felt safe and secure, inside a tastefully decorated, modestly wealthy flat, surrounded by others. Henrietta was quiet, unassuming and private, just a frail old lady whiling away her final years alive. Again, no one knows exactly when she was attacked on Saturday the 27th of October 1985, as the last time she was seen alive was at noon on her doorstep as she collected her milk, bread and papers. With no signs of a break-in, it's likely her door was accidentally left unlocked, hence why it was chosen. We also know she didn't let anyone in, as being deaf, she never heard the doorbell, and by then she was already in bed. Neighbours later stated that they heard a bang at around 2 a.m, but thought nothing of it. The room was slightly ransacked, with a few pound notes scattered on the floor and ornaments and furniture knocked over, possibly as the attacker fled. But burglary seemed uncertain, as roughly £1,000 in cash, £4,000 today was found in the flat, untouched. And yet a 10-inch Japanese earthenware vase from the 1920s was stolen, and even though it was rare, it was only worth about £50. But maybe the killer didn't know that. What seemed strange was that the burglary of her sitting room was brief and chaotic. Yet he spent an inordinate amount of time in her bedroom, torturing Henrietta. Out of sadism, hatred, or maybe both. As before, with one hand he strangled her. As with the other, possibly using his fist, he kept battering this helpless and disabled old lady until her face was bruised, bloody, and a swollen pulp. Again, with her slumped to the ground and barely conscious, he repeatedly kicked her and even stamped on her to the point where one of the vertebrae of her spine had cracked. But still, he wasn't finished with her. As he had with Barbara, using a knitting needle, in a sadistic detail deliberately left out of the press to trap the killer. Into her neck, he'd stabbed a ballpoint pen and left it embedded within. Then, to terrorize and cause her immense pain, either a thin knife or a chopstick had been rammed between her eyelid and her eyeball, perhaps to make her tell him where her money was, or maybe just for fun. For minutes or possibly hours, she endured a prolonged excruciating agony and terror, never knowing if he would let her live. but even that wasn't the end. On her bed, he vaginally raped this 86-year-old widow, then turned her over and anally raped her. And with her still face down and bleeding, he repeatedly stabbed her through both lungs so she couldn't breathe or scream, and set fire to the bed. Her murder was yet another massacre of a frail old lady by a maniac, who vanished without a trace. At 8 a.m. the next morning, a neighbour noticed smoke coming from the ventilator grill above the front door of Henrietta's flat. The caretaker called the fire brigade, and in the bedroom, her body was found. Still smouldering after several hours, the lower half of her body, her legs, anus and genitals, were destroyed by the fire, taking with it much of the evidence. But with multiple stab wounds to her chest, and at least 2 of the weapons used to torture her still embedded in her neck and face, detectives were called in. As before, the most sensational details of the case were reported by the press. Some were deliberately left out, those only the killer would know, and with this being potentially linked by detectives to the murder of Barbara Pinder, tabloid newspapers had already dubbed him the Saturday Night Slaughterer. This investigation was headed up by Detective Chief Superintendent Bill Carney, but as before, it looked unlikely to be solved. As the murder weapon, a 6-inch knife, was missing, no one was seen entering or leaving her flat. A set of fingerprints were found, but never connected to a known felon. And even though a nationwide murder hunt was launched and the case garnered mainstream coverage, DCS Carney stated,
"We're taking it very seriously. The possibility that they could all be connected."
As in the intervening weeks, 4 other women had been attacked on neighbouring streets. Several elderly women on the Lillington Gardens estate had been beaten, stabbed and robbed, with random outbreaks of arson at several homes of lone women across the previous year. On the Saturday before Henrietta's killing, an unnamed female pensioner was attacked on her doorstep by a stockily built man in his 30s who asked to be let in to watch the television. She escaped with just bruises. Yet on Tuesday the 30th of July 1985, on Warwick Way in Pimlico, Eileen McCarthy, a 60-year-old cleaner, was approached by a man, aged 35 to 40, 5'10", straight black hair, stockily built, round face, wearing a white sleeveless denim jacket, a light blue shirt and a dark coat, and at 5:45 p.m. near the junction of Belgrave Road, with no premeditation and having never seen him before. In a swift and frenzied attack, he stabbed her 3 times in the face. Not slashing, not cutting, but stabbing her with such ferocity, detectives described it
as plunging the knife in and literally ripping it apart until it broke the back of her skull.
She screamed. He fled, and taken to hospital, she made a slow but good recovery. At Westminster Coroner's Court, Dr. Paul Knapman declared that Henrietta's murder
was particularly macabre. No motive is apparent, and it is more disturbing that no one was caught or convicted of this crime. It would have been far more preferable if it had not had an inquest, but a murder trial instead.
And as the case stalled, the killings of Henrietta Osbourne and Barbara Pinder remained unsolved, until a killer who wanted to be caught confessed. But why? One year after Henrietta's murder, on the 30th of June 1986, police in Pimlico arrested a man who'd broken into the flats of 2 elderly neighbours on nearby Page Street, and for no reason set fire to their beds as they slept in them. 32-year-old David Mackenzie had lived in London for years, but was born in 1954 in the Scottish city of Inverness and raised in Dundee. Described as stocky and powerfully built, Mackenzie's education was limited, as being diagnosed age 6 with a non-specific personality disorder. Since 1976, he'd been asking doctors,
"I want to be somewhere not in the community, in a prison or a hospital."
As with no control over his actions, He told one psychiatrist about his sexual deviancy and his hatred of women. In his teens and 20s, he'd worked in hotels and as a hospital porter. But unemployed at the time of his arrest, he was known as a prolific, if unskilled and unremarkable burglar. For the last few years, Mackenzie had lived at Duke's house, a council-run tenement block on Vincent Road in Pimlico, in the shadow of Big Ben, and right at the back of the houses where he'd set fire to two old ladies in their beds. He wasn't a suspect in either of the killings, but being mentally unwell, his arrest resulted in him being put on a hospital order. So instead of serving time in prison, he was held at a psychiatric hospital as he was deemed a danger to the public. As on the 26th of June 1986, just 3 months before Henrietta's killing, in his flat, this self-confessed paedophile indecently assaulted, raped and buggered a 14-year-old girl. Charged with rape, when later questioned about the fires, on the 16th of August 1986, Mackenzie spent hours saying nothing, not even replying no comment to the detective's questions, as the balding 17-stole hulk just sat there, staring. But it was as he was asked, possibly jokingly,
"Do you have anything else to say in your defense?"
that, overpowered with the weight of guilt, he made a startling confession.
"I want to tell you about the old lady."
And unaided, this blabbermouth confessed to Barbara Pinder's murder, and according to the detectives,
he revealed details only the killer could have known.
On the 29th of August 1986, David Mackenzie was charged at Horse Ferry Road Magistrates Court. And while held on remand, again to the detectives he said,
"I want to tell you about the other old lady."
He confessed to the killing of Henrietta Osbourne, and on the 14th of November 1986, he was charged. A killer was caught. 2 murders were solved. The elderly women of Battersea and Pimlico were safe from a monster. And even though he never said why he did it, it concluded because he felt shamed. In his interviews with detectives, finally talking, the blabbermouth was open and frank about his heinous crimes, which he recounted unemotionally as if he was reading a set of instructions. Yet his head hung low in shame and his eyes were etched in guilt. When asked, he couldn't give any motive. And although his recollection was accurate and proved that he was there, he had some glaring errors in his memory, maybe caused by drink or drugs, fear or shame, or his limited mental capacity. But the paedophile, sadist and double killer David Mackenzie wouldn't immediately go to trial, as being sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Prison to be assessed. As a psychopathic paranoid schizophrenic, he wasn't deemed mentally fit to plead for 3 years. His confession was worth its weight in gold, but as 6 psychiatrists gave differing opinions on whether he actually knew the difference between reality or fantasy, fact or fiction, the problem was, in his mind, all of the details blurred into one, even in his own retelling. While confessing to killing Henrietta, Mackenzie said,
"I've spoken to my brother, Danny, and he asked me if I did it alone. I said no."
He then named his accomplice, a fellow burglar, a friend and an old flatmate, who was later arrested but released without charge as there was no evidence against him. In his statement, Mackenzie said,
"I intended to steal. I never meant her any harm."
But as she opened the door to him, so he claimed,
"I pushed her back, put my hand over her face, and this time I had the knife in my hand."
And with his supposed accomplice,
"We argued about what to do with her. It was him. He took the knife out of my hand and hit the old lady with it. We started looking about the flat. Then we both raped her."
Although that evidence was all destroyed by fire. But was Mackenzie a psychopath who only cared about himself and was hoping to reduce his charge by blaming his friend? Or a fantasist who couldn't tell the truth from a dream and the facts about his heinous crimes were lost inside his mind? On the 11th of January 1990, the trial for both arson attacks, the 14-year-old's rape, and the murders of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne began at the Old Bailey before Judge Kenneth Richardson QC. With Robin Gray QC as his defence, Mackenzie pleaded guilty to arson and 5 counts of unlawful sex with a child, but not guilty to both murders. Given his mental state, much of the evidence was based around whether he calculatedly killed both women or whether he wasn't mentally responsible. In his opening statement, John Bevan QC for the prosecution stated,
"The facts you are about to hear are, without exception, unpleasant and abhorrent. There is no doubt that he is a strange person. Sometimes what he says may not be true. He has his own motives for making up things and telling lies. As the prosecution, we accept that he has a personality disorder. He is suggestible and imagines things to be true when they are not. That does not prevent him from being a murderer."
Whereas his defence counsel stated,
"There is not a single shred of evidence besides the confession to link him to the killings."
But Mackenzie himself was never in court except to give evidence, stating,
"I find it upsetting to be there. It makes me feel guilty."
So he stayed inside his cell at Brixton Prison. Hearing the evidence, a jury of 7 women and 5 men found him not guilty of the murders of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne, but guilty of manslaughter by diminished responsibility. Summing up, Judge Kenneth Richardson QC described Mackenzie
as one of Britain's most dangerous killers. You have been found guilty of 2 of the most appalling killings I can recall. I am quite certain that you are a frighteningly dangerous man.
Sentenced on the 30th of March 1990, Judge Richardson said,
You will remain at Rampton High Security Hospital until such time that it is absolutely clear to those responsible for your care and release that you are no longer a danger to the public.
Held under Sections 37 and 41 of the Mental Health Act 1983, after 36 years, David Mackenzie remains there today. But those weren't the only crimes he confessed to. Having told detectives about the 2 old ladies he had murdered, being born and bred in Scotland, struggling with psychopathic schizophrenia, being a sadist, an arsonist, a rapist, and a paedophile with a hatred of women, as he had with Barbara and Henrietta, before the detectives, once again, the Blabbermouth began to speak. In a scattergun retelling, like his fractured memory was grasping at fragments of clues, lost in the foggy midst of his mind, he confessed to a wealth of other unsolved murders, retelling them in full detail. He had murdered a 27-year-old man in Hertfordshire, a 79-year-old woman in Shropshire, an 11-year-old girl on the Scottish borders, a 5-year-old girl in Edinburgh, and with 2 stabbings of victims who, like 60-year-old Eileen McCarthy, the cleaner who was randomly stabbed in the face in an unprovoked attack in Pimlico, had survived. A senior detective stated,
He may, someday, give us the information we want to close the files on these dreadful events which have haunted so many people for so long.
Guilt can be a strange thing, as with 2 brutal unsolved murders. What began with a silent man sitting passively in a police interrogation room, guilty of rape and arson, but saying nothing. This led detectives to a self-confessed serial killer and a series of unsolved murders across the UK, totaling as many as 10 or even 12. Part 2 of the Blabbermouth continues next week.